Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The wind in Enugu that afternoon carried heat and hush in equal measure, the kind of heat that settled on the skin like a second cloth. Iko stood in his small kitchen, bare-chested, with his trousers rolled up to the knee, a sponge in one hand and a stack of wet plates to his right. His fingers danced through soap-slick water as he washed the remnants of lunch from the plates, a low hum leaving his throat, a forgotten highlife tune his father used to sing when happiness was simple and cheap. The kitchen was warm, filled with the after-aroma of ogbono soup, its smoky scent still rising lazily from the pot. Amara, his wife, had done her magic once again, seasoning with care, stirring with love, her laughter echoing in the corridor as she moved about. Iko liked days like this. There was no war to fight, no masks to wear. Just home. Just her. He rinsed a plate and placed it on the rack, his eyes catching the outline of his wife's ankara wrapper as she swayed into the sitting room. It was only then the knock came, 3 slow, deliberate raps that felt heavier than the wood it struck. The kind of knock that didn't just ask to come in, it announced. Iko paused, wiped his hands on a faded kitchen towel, and walked toward the door, wondering who could be visiting uninvited at this hour of the afternoon. Pulling the curtain aside, his heartbeat skipped and rolled into itself. Standing on the other side of the screen door was Uncle Dominic, tall as a doorway, with a face carved from frowns and judgment. The man had the kind of presence that silenced radios and turned smiles into questions. Iko hesitated, only for a moment, then pulled the door open. "Uncle, welcome," he said with as much warmth as he could carry. Dominic stepped inside without waiting to be invited, his eyes sweeping across the room as though calculating the worth of every chair, every picture frame, every unseen mistake. He carried no bag, no sign of where he had come from, or how long he intended to stay. Just a scowl and a presence. Amara emerged from the hallway with that graceful charm that made strangers feel like guests, her voice bright and clear as fresh water. "Good afternoon, sir. You're welcome. I hope there was no traffic?" she asked, already reaching for the remote to lower the TV volume. Dominic didn't respond immediately. He stared at her like a question he didn't want to ask. "I'm fine," he muttered, taking the seat closest to the window, his large frame creaking the wood. Iko sat opposite him, legs crossed, masking the curiosity bubbling under his calm. "Should I get you something to drink, Uncle? Maybe a cold beer?" Iko offered, standing. Dominic nodded slowly, and the room sank into silence once again, the only sound being the distant honking from the road outside, and the ceiling fan ticking like a slow metronome keeping time on the tension that had just entered their home. Iko returned shortly after with the beer, beads of cold water racing down the brown bottle's body like tiny sprinters. He placed it gently on the side stool and returned to his seat. Amara reappeared with a covered tray, egusi soup with pounded yam so soft it could be mistaken for clouds. She served Dominic with practiced respect, setting the plate before him and placing a bowl of water beside it. "Please enjoy, sir," she said, before disappearing again, leaving only the soft scent of her perfume and the echo of her courtesy. Dominic ate in silence, his cutlery scraping the plate like a whisper with sharp edges. Iko, unsure whether to speak or stay silent, settled into his seat, legs gently bouncing. He could feel something building, an unspoken weight gathering like a storm behind clouds. There was something in the way Dominic chewed, in the way he barely looked up, that made the air thick, too heavy for this kind of afternoon. When Dominic was done, he shifted the tray aside without a word. Iko stood and, by habit, picked it up and walked back to the kitchen. As he washed the used plate under running water, he caught his own reflection in the small kitchen window. There was a flicker of something there, maybe pride, maybe confusion. The kind of reflection that makes you question how much of your father lives in your hands. He wiped his hands dry again, steadied his breath, and walked back into the sitting room, unaware that the warmth of his peaceful afternoon had already started to slip quietly out the window. Just as he crossed the threshold into the sitting room, Amara emerged once again, now wearing a different gown, her hair loosely packed, phone in one hand and her car keys jingling in the other. She smiled at Iko and said, "Honey, let me quickly go and see my client. I'll be back before sunset. Please don't forget to bring in the clothes before the rain starts." She leaned in, brushed her lips softly against his cheek, and walked toward the door. The room held its breath. Eco turned and caught the corner of Dominic's eyes, sharp and cold like harmattan breeze against open skin. The door clicked shut behind Amara, and with it, the mask Dominic had been wearing all afternoon slipped. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers like a man about to begin an interrogation. "So, you're now a woman in your own house?" The question was not a question. It was a blow dressed in words. Eco blinked. "Sir?" Dominic laughed, the kind of laugh that carried no joy, just pity and poison. "You serve your wife. She sends you out in front of me. You pick plates. You obey like a child. This is what marriage has turned you into." Eco said nothing yet, but his silence was an agreement. It was calculation. He could feel the temperature of the room change. Whatever had brought Dominic to this house wasn't food or hospitality. It was something older. Maybe fear. Maybe control. Or maybe a shadow from the life Dominic thought every man should live. But Eco just sat, listening, watching, waiting for the full storm to come down. Eco's first instinct was to laugh, not because Dominic's words were funny, but because they were so far removed from the peace he had built that they felt like noise echoing from a distant cave. But laughter in that moment would have been fuel to a fire, so he chose silence. Dominic leaned closer, eyes narrowed, the lines on his forehead deepening, as if his thoughts had grown too heavy for his skull. "You think I'm joking? Your wife gives you instructions like a housemaid, and you smile like it's something noble. She tells you when to talk, when to move, when to breathe. And you do it. In my day, a man was a man. His word was the roof under which the house stood. My wife calls me sir, not because I force her to, but because she knows where respect belongs." His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room like floodwater seeping under the door, slow, invasive, unwelcome. Eco shifted his weight, clasped his hands in his lap, and inhaled deeply. "Uncle, Amara isn't commanding me. She was going out, and she reminded me about something that affects the both of us. That's not weakness, sir. That's partnership." The word landed like a pebble on iron. Dominic's face twisted into something between disgust and disbelief. "Partnership?" he echoed. "That's what they're calling it now. Let me tell you something, no matter how much you kneel, she will never see you as a man. Women are like rivers. If you don't build a strong bank, they'll overflow and drown you. She's already leading the home, and you're there smiling, washing plates like a nanny goat. You are the one wearing the wrapper now." His words poured out with the weight of generations behind them, but they struck Eco with less impact than intended. Not because they didn't sting, but because Eco had already buried that version of manhood long ago. Still, the room didn't breathe. The ticking of the wall clock now sounded like footsteps pacing overhead. Eco leaned back, letting Dominic speak, though every word felt like dust settling on something clean. "You know why women in this generation act the way they do?" Dominic continued, shaking his head slowly. "Because men like you give them space. You lower yourself, thinking it's love. You open your mouth to say things like partnership and equality. Before you know it, your wife is sitting on your head, and you'll be too blind to realize. My wife doesn't step out of the house without asking for permission. She doesn't speak when I speak. That's how you build respect. That's how you keep a woman loyal." He adjusted his seat, like a king recounting battles. "If you were my son, I would have beaten that foolishness out of you. You think a woman like Amara will continue to respect you once she sees she can order you around." There was venom in his tone, but beneath it, if one listened closely, there was something else too. Something hollow. Maybe fear. Maybe regret. Maybe a crack in the pride he wore like a second skin. Eco finally spoke, slowly, not to argue but to state truth. "Everything I've become, I learned by watching my father. I watched him carry my mother's bag without shame. I saw him cook on nights she returned home tired. They never shouted at each other. Never raised hands. But the respect they shared, uncle, I still feel it in my bones. And I decided, that's the kind of man I want to be." Dominic blinked, lips parting slightly, but no words came out. He looked away just for a second. It was quick, almost invisible, but Eco caught it. The look of a man who had walked far down a path and just realized he might have made a wrong turn many years ago. The atmosphere inside the sitting room had thickened, like harmattan fog rolling into a compound before the rooster wakes. Eco stood up, slow and deliberate, and walked to the window. He drew the curtain halfway and stared out at nothing in particular, just the edge of the balcony railing, the shadow of a neighbor's plantain tree, a quiet stretch of street catching the last warmth of the sun. Dominic remained silent now, his earlier storm quieting into a reluctant drizzle. Eco turned back to him, speaking softly, You may not agree with how I live, and that's fine. But don't mistake kindness for weakness. Amara is not above me. She walks beside me. That's what we chose. Dominic shook his head, scoffing as he reached for his beer. He took a long swig, as though hoping the drink would drown his thoughts. Well, I'm not surprised. I've been watching. I knew this day would come. You serving beer like a steward, washing dishes like a kitchen boy, nodding to your wife's schedule. Just know, she will never respect you. And that day she'll show you, you won't see it coming. The kind of woman that commands in the morning and giggles in the evening. Be careful, Iko. You're creating a monster with soft hands. Iko didn't flinch. He didn't respond immediately. He let the silence grow roots. In his heart, he felt sadness, not just for the insults, but for the man before him. Dominic, who had buried love under fear, who had confused respect with silence, who mistook obedience for reverence. Iko returned to his seat and looked at the man who was family, but now felt like a voice from an era long gone. Sir, you're welcome to rest. I'll go check on something in the backyard, he said quietly, leaving Dominic to stew in his own storm cloud. He stepped out through the back door and let the evening air wrap itself around him. The compound was quiet, save for the distant sound of children playing down the street. A faint smell of smoke from someone's cooking fire curled through the air, mingling with the scent of drying clothes fluttering gently on the line. He looked up at the sky, clouds gathering lazily, like friends arriving late to a village meeting. He remembered Amara's words, "Don't forget to bring in the clothes." And so he began, one peg at a time, removing shirts and wrappers, folding them carefully. Each cloth felt like a small moment shared, a laugh, a dance in the rain, a quiet night. This was their life, their story, and no man, not even one bound by outdated pride, could rewrite it for him. He stood there for a moment, holding a blouse of hers to his chest, smiling slightly. The door creaked behind him. He turned, expecting Dominic. But it was silence, just the creak of an old hinge and a gentle breeze. Somewhere in the compound, a bird let out a single note, as if affirming the stillness of things. Iko exhaled deeply, folded the last of the clothes, and turned to go back inside. He had no idea that this afternoon would stay with him for a long time, or that the very man who called him weak would later scream for help, naked and barefoot, chased by the consequences of a house built on fear instead of love. Evening came with its own kind of silence, one that didn't demand attention, but simply wrapped itself around the house like an old shawl. Iko sat by the veranda, a mug of warm water between his palms, staring out into the dimming streets of their Enugu neighborhood. The day had stretched itself like thick ogbono, dragging its emotions across the hours until they could no longer be ignored. Amara returned a little past 7, her car headlights dancing across the compound wall before she parked. He didn't call out. She didn't ask questions. She stepped out of the car with her usual calm grace, carrying the scent of body spray and city air. Inside, they sat across from each other, their silence rich and filled with quiet knowing. Iko eventually broke it, not with drama, not with bitterness, but with simple words. He said, "I'm now the woman in the house." Amara paused, one hand still on the lid of the food flask she had just brought in. She looked up slowly, her lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but into something softer. "He said that?" she asked, almost laughing. "He said a lot more," Iko added, rubbing the back of his neck like the words had left fingerprints there. "Said you won't ever respect me. Said my kindness will backfire. Said he rules his home with silence and fear, and that anything less makes a man weak." Amara finally released the laughter building in her chest. It came out rich and clean, echoing off the walls. It wasn't mocking. It was the kind of laugh that belongs to people who've seen both chaos and peace and have made their choice. She stood, went to the kitchen, and returned with 2 plates. No fuss, no formalities. She dished the egusi soup and set it between them, the aroma floating gently, invitingly. Iko smiled at the ease with which she moved through their life. There was no struggle here, no battles for control, just rhythm. They ate together, speaking in between swallows, their conversation dancing from her client's stubborn demands to the price of tomatoes in the market. Only after the plates had been cleared and rinsed did the conversation gently return to Dominic. "You know," Amara began, wiping her hands on a cloth, "a man like your uncle was raised in a world where love came with conditions, where power meant silence and control passed for respect. That kind of thinking, once it grips someone, it becomes like rust on iron. Slow, stubborn, and dangerous." Iko nodded. "And the sad part is he doesn't even see the weight he's carrying. He wears it like armor, not realizing it's what's sinking him. Amara walked over, sat beside him, and laid her head on his shoulder. "But you're not him," she said softly. "We're not them, and we won't become them. We built something different, something that listens, that shares." He kissed her forehead, letting her words sink deep into the tired corners of his mind. Outside, the crickets had begun their evening chorus, the breeze had cooled, and somewhere a generator hummed like a low lullaby. Peace had returned, even after the storm Dominic tried to bring into their walls. But something lingered in Eco's chest, an ache not of doubt, but of sadness for a man who had chosen fear where there could have been warmth. That night, sleep came in waves. Eco tossed between dreams that made little sense and thoughts that wouldn't leave him alone. At one point, he found himself dreaming of his parents, his father in the backyard, tending to the garden, while his mother sat nearby, humming a tune that seemed older than her own voice. They didn't speak in the dream, but their silence was whole. Eco awoke before dawn, bathed in a mixture of sweat and clarity. The dream hadn't brought answers, only reminders. Of what could be. Of what once was. The next morning, Amara was already up, her voice drifting through the bathroom door as she sang, off-key but cheerfully. He stood at the doorway and watched her through the mirror's reflection, and for a moment, he saw the future clearly, not as a prediction but as a choice. They weren't perfect, but they were intentional, and that made all the difference. After breakfast, he called Dominic. Not out of guilt, not even obligation, but because peace demands effort. Dominic didn't answer. Eco tried again an hour later. Still nothing. He left a message. "Uncle, thanks for visiting. Take care of yourself." No anger. No confrontation. Just a sentence. That was enough. Some walls weren't meant to be broken down by arguments. Some would only fall when the person inside got tired of staring at bricks. And Eco knew, deep in the quiet space of his spirit, that Dominic's own house had cracks not even he could see. The week passed like a slow river after rain, gentle, steady, and filled with small things that made life meaningful. Eco returned to work, Amara met more clients, and the house remained filled with light laughter and the scent of warm meals. But the shadow of that conversation with Dominic lingered, not like a storm cloud, but like a forgotten book on the shelf, always there, even if unopened. On Friday evening, Amara returned home unusually quiet. Eco noticed it the moment she walked in. Her face didn't carry its usual brightness. "Is everything okay?" he asked as she untied her scarf. She hesitated before answering. "I ran into your cousin, Ozioma. She mentioned something strange, said Uncle Dominic and his wife haven't been seen outside in days. That people have been hearing noises. Shouting. Breaking things." Eco's brows furrowed. He felt an old feeling rise inside him. Not guilt, not fear, something else. A knot forming where concern meets confirmation. "No one's checked on them?" Amara shook her head. Ozioma said neighbors are tired. They said it's always one fight or another. People are just used to it now. Eco sat down slowly, processing the words. So this was what Dominic meant by control. This was the reward for fear disguised as respect. A house that rumbled like a volcano, yet everyone pretended it was just wind passing through. Amara took his hand, squeezed it gently. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that quiet room, with its faint smell of pepper soup and its well-worn furniture, two people sat in silence, grateful for the path they chose, yet haunted by the man who couldn't walk it. It was a Saturday when Eco and Amara finally decided to pay Dominic a visit. It had been over a week since Ozioma's passing mention of trouble in Dominic's home, and though silence had returned to their compound, that lingering thought of something being off never quite left Eco's mind. The air that morning had a strange weight to it, neither heavy with rain nor light with wind, just still, as if the sky itself was watching and waiting. Amara wore a plain blue dress, tied her hair in a scarf, and carried a flask of hot rice and stew out of courtesy. Eco didn't speak much as he drove. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his thoughts ran with the quiet panic of a man anticipating the unknown. The road to Dominic's part of Accra layout was filled with potholes and lined with shops that looked more like extensions of people's living rooms. When they finally reached the gate, something didn't feel right. It was ajar, swinging ever so slightly, creaking with the rhythm of uncertainty. Inside, voices rose, not the kind of domestic chatter that homes usually produce, but the sharp clashing sounds of chaos unrestrained. A pot crashed. A shrill scream followed. Then silence. Then another crash. Eco parked immediately, heart pounding now like it had grown its own legs. Amara clutched his hand, but said nothing. Together, they stepped into the compound, only to find two neighbors standing by the fence, arms crossed, watching like people at a football match they had seen too many times. Iko approached one of the neighbors, a short man with tired eyes and a face that had grown used to the ugly side of people's marriages. "What's happening?" Iko asked. The man barely glanced at him before replying. "Not them again. They don't start." His voice was dry, lacking surprise or concern, as though drama had become wallpaper in this compound. "We don't tire. Every time, nah fight. If no be bottle today, nah boiling ring tomorrow. We don't reach point where we no day separate dem again. Make dem kill themselves if dem want kill themselves." The words stung, not just because they were cruel, but because they were real. They came from the mouth of a man who had given up on caring. And in that moment, Iko realized that Dominic's idea of respect had not built him a kingdom, but a prison with many witnesses and no intervention. Another neighbor, an elderly woman with powder on her neck and a wrapper tied twice around her waist, sighed and added, "We done call police before. Dipio say na family matter. But one day that woman go really kill am, and we go all say we see him coming." Before Iko could respond, a commotion erupted from within the house. The door flung open with a bang, and out came Dominic, half-dressed, barefoot, panting like someone who had run from a demon. His eyes were wide, his lip cut, a welt rising near his cheekbone. He didn't even notice them standing there. Behind him came the sound of shattering glass. Then a pestle flew through the doorway, landing dangerously close to where Iko stood. There was a brief pause in the world. Even the wind seemed to stop and watch. Dominic stumbled across the compound, clutching his side, shouting in a voice that cracked under panic, "This woman wants to kill me, oh! She wants to kill me today." His voice rang out, not with authority but with desperation. It was the voice of a man who no longer ruled, no longer controlled, no longer pretended. A voice stripped bare. Amara's grip tightened on Iko's wrist, her eyes following Dominic as he dashed past them without recognition. The man they once knew to walk like thunder was now fleeing like smoke. The woman inside shouted insults loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear, her words sharp and dirty, flung like broken plates. "You day mad. You day craze. Now you go control me? You go day command me like Pekin? Come back make I show you say your madness never reach my own." Her voice pierced every wall and left nothing to the imagination. Dominic disappeared around the corner, still shirtless, still running. A silence settled for a moment, then chuckles from some of the neighbors who'd seen the scene play out too many times to be shocked. But Iko didn't laugh. He stood still, frozen by something deeper than surprise. It wasn't just the shock of seeing his uncle so exposed. It was the realization that everything Dominic had tried to teach him, the pride, the fear, the control, had led to this moment. This shame. This unraveling. As they stood there, unsure of whether to go inside or turn around, Amara whispered, "Let's go." And without saying another word, they both turned and walked back to the car. Iko's footsteps felt heavier than before, like the weight of a whole legacy had settled on his back. As he opened the door for Amara, he looked back one last time at the house. From the outside, it looked like any other house, cement walls, faded paint, a curtain flapping from the window. But now he saw it clearly. It wasn't a home. It was a battlefield, where words were grenades and silence was shrapnel. Inside that house, there was no partnership, no softness, no compromise. Only survival. As he started the engine, the car hummed beneath them, smooth and quiet. Amara rested her head against the window, watching the houses blur past as they drove away. Neither of them spoke for a long time. But inside the silence, there was something sacred. Not fear, not judgment, just understanding. That they had seen both sides of the coin, and theirs was the one that didn't leave wounds in its wake. As they left the compound behind, Iko's grip on the steering wheel tightened, not in anger, but in resolve. A quiet promise passed between his fingers. Whatever it took, whatever storms came, his house would remain a shelter. Not a throne room, not a cage, but a place where both he and his wife could breathe without looking over their shoulders. That night, the silence in Iko's house had a weight it had never carried before. It wasn't the silence of unresolved conflict or unspoken tension, but something else, like the quiet that descends on a room after the last guest has left and the laughter has faded into memory. Amara sat on the edge of the bed, her back straight, her scarf untied, letting her hair fall carelessly around her shoulders. She wasn't speaking, but her thoughts were loud. Iko sat by the window, watching the moonlight spill across their tiled floor, and wondering how a man like Dominic, who once thundered into every room like a judge delivering final sentences, could now be running barefoot in fear of a woman he swore would never defy him. There was no satisfaction in the memory, no sense of justice or karma. Only sadness. The kind that makes your throat tighten even when no tears are coming. He remembered Dominic's words clearly, sharp as they had sounded in that sitting room weeks ago, about control, about obedience, about respect that was rooted in fear. But today had broken that myth like a mirror against concrete. The man who claimed to rule with an iron hand had been undone by the same grip he once used to hold down another. And Iko, watching it unfold, didn't feel victorious. He only felt tired, because he understood now, more than ever, that what people called strength was often just the fear of softness wearing a mask. The next morning, Amara spoke first. Her voice was quiet, but firm, like a woman who had been turning over many thoughts through the night and had finally decided which ones to say aloud. She placed a cup of tea before Iko and sat beside him. "That house we walked into yesterday, it used to scare me," she began. "Not because of the shouting, but because I used to think maybe we were the strange ones. That maybe I was doing too much. Talking too much. Loving you too loudly." Iko turned to her, his eyes soft, waiting. "But now I see it clearly. Love isn't supposed to leave bruises, or make you afraid of your own home. It's not supposed to shrink one person so the other can feel big." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. There was a shared understanding in the air now, one that didn't need further explanation. They had seen something raw and ugly, and instead of drawing them apart, it had reminded them why they built what they did. They were not perfect, but they were real, and that in itself was rare. Iko took a sip of his tea, then leaned back in his chair. "Do you know what scared me the most yesterday?" he asked. Amara shook her head. It wasn't Dominic. It wasn't even the pestle flying across the compound. It was the laughter of the neighbors. How normal it all felt to them. Like watching a man's dignity crash wasn't surprising anymore. That kind of pain, when it becomes background noise, that's when you know the damage is deeper than shouting. She nodded, leaning into his shoulder. The warmth between them wasn't loud, but it was sure. The kind of warmth that needed no performance. The day passed slowly, as most Sundays in Enugu do, with the city moving like an old man in slippers, unbothered by the rush of time. Iko stayed home while Amara went to see a client at Independence Layout, but even as she stepped out, she turned back 3 times. Once to blow a kiss, once to remind him about lunch, and once just to smile. These weren't the actions of a woman who didn't respect her husband. They were the movements of someone who had found comfort in the rhythm of care. He spent most of the afternoon attending to the garden in the backyard. The hibiscus flowers had started to lean from the weight of last week's rain, and the scent of wet soil reminded him of childhood, of days spent playing with his younger cousins behind his parents' old house in Succa. He remembered his father's voice, calm but firm, calling them in for dinner, and his mother's laughter, always the last thing to fade before night fell. He crouched to prune a stubborn weed, and found his mind wandering back to Dominic, not to what he had said, but to what he might be doing now. Had he gone back inside that house? Was he licking his wounds in silence? Or was he still outside, somewhere, wondering how everything had slipped from his hands like water he thought he could clench into shape? The thought lingered, but Iko didn't let it weigh him down. He stood up, wiped his hands, and went inside to start boiling rice. The kitchen filled with the scent of onion and thyme, and as the pot steamed, so did the memory of yesterday. Less sharply now, more like something fading into the corner of the room. Evening came, and with it, Amara's return. She brought fried fish wrapped in newspaper, a smile in her step, and dust on her heels. They ate together in the living room, not speaking much, but not needing to. Later, as they folded laundry on the bed, she looked up at him and asked, "Do you think your uncle will change?" Iko paused, holding one of his shirts, eyes fixed on the floor for a moment before answering. People change when they run out of excuses, or when they finally get tired of bleeding in silence. But not everyone survives long enough to make that turn. She didn't ask anything else. She just nodded, finished folding the blouse in her hand, and placed it in the drawer. That night, they lay in bed under the soft hum of the ceiling fan. The air was cooler now, the storm had passed, and the night was without drama. As Iko closed his eyes, he thought of all the men who had been taught to rule instead of feel, to command instead of communicate. And he hoped, silently, that their sons would unlearn what their fathers never questioned. Somewhere in the dark, Amara's hand found his. Their fingers intertwined naturally, without force, without fear. And in that small gesture, Iko knew they had won, Not a battle against Dominic, but a victory over the patterns that had tried to sneak into their home. A quiet rebellion against the loud expectations of a world that mistook volume for value. And as sleep took them, peace wrapped itself around the house like a promise being kept. The weeks that followed passed like footprints in wet sand, visible, heavy, but slowly fading under time's quiet sweep. Life in Eco and Amara's home returned to its normal rhythm, but the memory of what they had witnessed in Dominic's compound lingered like smoke from a fire long put out. Nothing dramatic happened in the days immediately after. There were no calls from Dominic, no messages, no apologies. But once, on a Sunday afternoon while Eco stood outside watering the garden, he saw a cab drop Dominic at the street corner. The man stepped out slowly, thinner than before, wearing sunglasses even though there was no sun, and carrying a black nylon bag that didn't seem to hold much. He didn't look up. He didn't scan the road like someone looking to be noticed. He simply walked toward his compound like someone who had misplaced the energy to perform pride. Eco didn't call out. He simply watched. And as Dominic reached his gate, he paused for the briefest moment, just long enough to suggest he knew someone was watching, then slipped inside like wind through a narrow crack. Eco didn't mention it to Amara. He didn't need to. Some things no longer needed explanations between them. Their silences had grown fluent, their understanding full of the kind of intimacy that doesn't announce itself. They had seen too much to return to idle chatter. Even as they sat together in the evenings, sipping Zobo or sharing fruits from the fridge, the mood was calmer now, more reflective. Like two people who had crossed a river and come back with a story. One day, Eco received an unexpected call from Dominic's son in Abuja. A young man named Chijioke who barely visited and often spoke like a stranger to his own father. His voice on the line was hurried and distant, as though the conversation was something to get over with quickly. Uncle Eco, good afternoon. I just wanted to confirm, is it true my dad and mum are no longer living together? The question came without context, without warmth. Eco paused, then answered with as much honesty as he could offer without dragging open wounds into daylight. I don't live with them, Chijioke, but I do know things are not the way they used to be. There was a brief silence. Then the boy, who was now a man, sighed. It's not surprising, really. Growing up in that house was like living inside a boiling pot. We were always afraid. You couldn't laugh too loud. You couldn't even cough without permission. His voice cracked, then steadied. Anyway, thank you. I'll call him sometime. The call ended just as abruptly as it began. Eco stared at the phone screen for a long time afterward, thinking not about what had been said, but about what hadn't. The way Chijioke's voice carried both relief and guilt. The way he sounded like someone who had walked away from a crumbling building, but still carried dust in his lungs. That night, Eco told Amara about the call. She listened quietly, nodding as he spoke, her eyes betraying no surprise. I think that boy just needed to hear that someone else saw what he saw, she said softly. Sometimes the most painful part of pain is thinking you imagined it. Eco nodded. And just like that, a bridge was built between memories and healing, one conversation at a time. Sometime in August, long after the dust of Dominic's public humiliation had settled, Amara received an invitation to speak at a women's business forum. It was one of those weekend gatherings where professionals shared their journeys and offered advice. She was hesitant at first, unsure of what she could say that hadn't already been said. But Eco encouraged her. Tell your truth. Someone will hear it and feel less alone, he said. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and agreed to go. The day of the event arrived, and Eco drove her to the venue, a small hall near GRA, modest but packed. As she walked onto the small stage with a microphone in hand, Eco watched from the back row. Her voice filled the room, not loud, not theatrical, but steady. She didn't speak about Dominic. She didn't name names or point fingers. She spoke about building a home with intention, about choosing peace over performance, about the joy of being loved in full without needing to earn it every day. She told them how she and her husband shared tasks, decisions, and dreams. And she ended by saying, when you love someone, you don't dominate them. You grow with them. You hold the umbrella when they forget theirs. You cook the soup when their back is aching. And when the world mocks your softness, you smile, because you know your home is built on rock, not ego. The applause that followed was loud, but Eco barely heard it. He only saw her, the woman who had held his hand through storms without raising her voice. And in that moment, he felt something deeper than pride. He felt gratitude. Months later, Eco would sometimes pass Dominic's street on the way to the mechanic or market, and from time to time, he would catch a glimpse of the old man sweeping his compound slowly, his face more relaxed, his gait less rigid. They never spoke, not directly. But once their eyes met, just briefly, and in that glance there was no hostility. No shame. Only something that looked like acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not apology, just the silent agreement of two men who had taken different roads. One had walked a path of noise, control, and collapse. The other had chosen a route of listening, patience, and quiet strength. Iko didn't need Dominic to say sorry. Life had already done that on his behalf. And sometimes, when evening came and the sun dipped low over the roof, Iko would sit outside with Amara and their son, now learning to spell simple words and asking endless questions. They would laugh about his curious mind, his dramatic drawings, his habit of asking why after every answer. And Iko would hold him close and think, this is what legacy should feel like. Not fear, not silence, but laughter in an open room. The past no longer haunted their home. It sat outside, like an old coat no one wore anymore. And as the moon rose over Enugu, casting its silver glow over the city, Iko understood with his whole chest that being a man was never about who stood tallest or spoke the loudest. It was about how much light you allowed into your home. And he had chosen, from the very beginning, to let love in, and to leave the door open. If this story has whispered anything to your heart, let it be this. Peace is never weakness, and love is not measured by how loud you speak, but how gently you care. Build your home on understanding, not pride. Don't be afraid to choose humility in a world that worships control. A quiet house full of respect is worth more than a loud one filled with fear. Be the kind of partner who gives peace, not pressure. And always remember, true strength is not in who commands, but in who chooses love over ego. Now let's pray. Father, thank you for the gift of love that teaches more than power ever could. May every listener find peace in their homes, wisdom in their hearts, and joy in the quiet moments that matter. Bless every marriage, every relationship, and every soul seeking healing. May pride never sit on the throne of our hearts. Give us the grace to build with patience, to lead with love, and to serve without shame. Where there is chaos, let peace return. Where there is bitterness, let kindness grow. Where there are wounds, let your healing flow. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. And if you believe it, shout a big Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.